Hello and welcome back to the God Core Podcast. I'm your host, Destiny Finn, and today we are finally diving into the Gospels. But before we dive into them with the stars, I want to dive into them with their contradictions. And there is a few reasons for that. One, I want to begin to show you that these are not historical accounts, but rather Greco-Roman style mythologies. And so if we can understand that and separate the indoctrination that we may or may not have been raised with, it will be easier for us to then dive into those stories and see how they very much do reflect the stars and also our psychology. Because if you were raised in fundamentalism, much like I was, or in a lot of sects of Christianity with their theology, they teach you that this is the Word of God. It's 100% true. There are no contradictions. And they also teach that the Gospels, commonly known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are factual historical accounts. Both of which are false, okay? And we're going to start to see that today, because if they were factual historical accounts, then they should all align. But the fact that there's contradictions and that these stories do not all align then begs for questioning of, hey, maybe, just maybe, these are not historical kind of journal pieces of like, yeah, this happened on this day, but rather they're mythologies. And if they're mythologies, then the question is, what are these stories trying to teach us, and what do they have to say about the heavens, and what do they have to say about us? So that's why I want to spend some time today just on contradictions, and I do also want to go over just the Gospels in general. With that being said, when I say Gospels, I'm using the Christian theology of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even though I personally believe that the Gospel is a power, as you see in Romans 1:16. But just so that we were all on the same page today, if you hear me say Gospels, I'm referring to the first 4 books of the New Testament. So with that being said, we don't actually know who wrote the Gospels. They are all written by secondhand authors who never met the guy named Yeshua, who our character Jesus is based off of. And the Jesus in our Bible is Stoicism Jesus, kind of the righteous good path. And I say that and clarify that because in early Christianity, in the 1st through 4th century, there were many different sects of Christianity, and there were many different stories of Jesus, okay? And there were many different tellings of what he looked like and how he talked to people and how he treated people. And so the Jesus of the Bible is Stoicism Jesus. And again, these authors never met the guy named Yeshua, who this character is based off of. And so the earliest out of the 4 books was Mark, and that was written approximately 65 to 75 CE, which would have been 35 to 45 years after the supposed death of Jesus, if his death was approximately 30 CE. Matthew and Luke were both written approximately 80 to 90 CE, taking you to 50 to 60 years. Now, some do argue that Luke was written earlier, before the book of Acts, around 58 to 65 by some traditional scholars, but most modern scholars actually argue that it was written later, taking you to 80 to 90. And then John, which is our most detailed book out of the Gospels, if you've ever spent time reading and studying each of them, that one was written 90 to 100 CE, taking you to 60 to 70 years after the supposed death of Jesus. Okay? And I don't know if you've ever played telephone, but if these are literal historical accounts, as some people like to argue in their theology, 30 to 40 to 60 to 70 years afterwards by secondhand writers, you're going to tell me that's accurate. I don't know if you've ever played the game telephone just within the same room, within the same 10 minutes of going around a circle, but that even gets confusing, okay? And I also want to note here, Paul's letters come first, okay? Paul's undisputed letters are the earliest surviving Christian writings that we possess, and his writings were roughly 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death, still giving you a 15-year onward gap between his letters and then these gospel scene accounts of the tellings of Jesus. And Paul tells us something fascinating in Galatians 1, 15 through 19, is that he did not begin his message sitting down with Jesus' original disciples or learning Jesus' life story from them. He describes his calling as a revelation of Jesus Christ and says only later did he meet Peter and James. And that is where some people within certain sects of Christianity and some people have their ideology saying that Paul is evil. Now, personally, I don't think that Paul was evil. Now, yes, I do think a lot of Christianity teaches more Paul's teachings than they do Jesus's teachings. You see a lot of sects, especially like, let's say in fundamentalism, you see Jesus elevating women, and then the fundamentalist sects take Paul's, or I should say pseudo-Paul's letter and says, you have to be quiet because you're a woman. And it's like, that is a letter, not a universal command, and letters aren't even the word of God, if you want to argue that. Either way, I personally don't believe that Paul is evil, and I say that because when you read things through an esoteric lens, okay, and from like a higher state of consciousness, when you read his letters, you're starting to see a lot of like esoteric language within them of inner transformation happening. You know, he talks about the spiritual body and the physical body. He talks about the death and the resurrection, and all of these terminologies and these lingos that when you read something, let's say through more of like a Gnostic lens, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's talking about inner transformation. And so his revelation, yes, I do like to be wary when anytime somebody says, oh, I received this revelation from the Lord, because that is how false prophets work. I mean, look at Ellen White and all these other false prophets throughout history. But I do have to say, seeing the language, I would argue that Paul probably, much like me and other Christians that I have met, he started off in the Orthodox religion. You know, he was all about the tradition and the rules. And then the Son of Man came like lightning east from the west. That consciousness just birthed inside of him. And he's like, whoa, wait a second. I have a whole new understanding now of this. Like, I actually get it. And that's when he tried to start putting it in his own language. And then also you do see him trying to organize the early Christians, because again, there were lots of sects of Christianity. There were certain sects that were definitely female-led, and you had female bishops. You had certain sects that were a lot more male-led. And so you had all of these then disagreements about theology, just like we do in today. We've still all yet to get on the same page. Hell, we can't even get on the same page of how many books are supposed to be in the Bible. And so I do have my reservations. Like, yes, I don't agree with everything the man says, but also I truly think that he did have that kind of spiritual awakening. And it was like, you know, this light came to him and he's like, oh, I get it now. You know, especially if you are somebody who studies the texts and the laws for years and years and years, there just comes this point that something just finally clicks, you know. And again, that consciousness, Christ in you, comes alive, and that is the second coming of Jesus within you when you understand that these are all talking about something inward as well as the stars, because as above, so below. So that's my personal beliefs. You're free to have your own. Either way, Paul actually did know about some of the traditions concerning the historical Jesus, because you do see, like in 1 Corinthians, he preserves traditions about Jesus' final meal, the early traditions concerning his death and burial and resurrection and appearances, attributes teachings on divorce to the Lord, as well as refers to a command of Jesus concerning those proclaiming the gospel. But Paul's focus is dramatically different from the later gospels that then are written, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Paul gives us almost no continual biography of Jesus, no Bethlehem story, no Magi, no Sermon on the Mount, no parables of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son, no detailed miracle ministry, no Judas narrative, no empty tomb discovery, none of that, okay? He just takes kind of theology and he writes it, and that's also, again, where the argument comes of like, yeah, Paul started his own religion and that's what Christianity follows, you know, he's evil. Either way, I do want to just bring that up and note, because if a dead man was being raised from the dead, like a lot of Christians believe, I feel like Paul would have probably mentioned that. But all of these miracles and all of these things, virgin birth, being raised from the dead, that we see in these Greco-Roman style mythologies, were very common in that time period that these stories were being written. Honestly, virgin birth, nothing new. It was a common Tuesday event. Resurrection myths, there were hundreds of them. Honestly, it was so popular in that time period. There were Roman laws about grave robbing, because people they would steal the bodies to proclaim that that person had been raised from the dead. And you even note that because in one of the Gospels, the writer makes sure to note that there were Romans outside of the tomb trying to prove that his Savior, you know, his God was the one true God. And look at that. How was he able to get out if there were Romans guarding it? And so you do, when you understand the history and you understand the time period, you start to look at these Gospels through a whole new light. And it honestly, you find great humor seeing the like lengths that these writers went through in trying to write like this biography and like this historical telling of Jesus to try to prove why their cult was the one right true cult compared to all the other cults that were just like it in the ancient world. One of the most common also being Apollonisis, which was known as the pagan Christ or the Antichrist from the certain sects of Christianity, because they deeply hated, because Apollonisis actually in some tellings outperformed Jesus. So it makes for a really fun time. Anyways, I do want to note that 2 of these Gospels start in the spring with the spring equinox with Aries. You know, you're saved by the blood of the Lamb. and slash by the blood of the bull. And then 2 of these gospels start in the winter with the winter solstice. And that is when the sun is in the sky at like its lowest point, and then it leaves the tomb, and then it starts making its journey back up. And so both Matthew and Luke start in December and end in December with the full cycle. And I'm going to actually just write that over here because I know I have my light over there. So both of these are December, approximately December 21st, because that is when the winter solstice takes place. And then both Mark and John start in Aries and then finish in Pisces, which, if you know anything about astrology or a zodiac chart, then you have full circle. Aries is number 1, Pisces is number 12, because that's also how the soul's journey starts. It starts with the birth, with the new beginning, going forth, I am, and it ends with I surrender, being dissolved into completion of 100% unity. You become that true mystic. You know, you're the intermediary between the worlds, and then you continually go on to be the serpent bearer, known as Ophiuchus, and all of that fun stuff when it gets to esoteric terminology. So I'm going to write these up here real quick. And it's important to note that when these start, because there are 4 points within the calendar year in the sun's journey that are deemed sacred and super important. And they're so sacred and important that most of our holidays are actually based around these calendar dates. You know, you have Christmas, you have Easter, you have Pentecost, and then you have Day of Atonement, which is the most sacred day of the year. And that also makes one of the sacred cosmic crosses, because remember, symbols overlap. So you have the cosmic cross of the fixed zodiac, but then you also have the cosmic cross of these 4 dates. And on the sun's journey, like if you were to look at the sun taking its journey, you do. So you start with the spring equinox, that's Aries, okay? It starts March 21st. Then the sun starts going up into the sky, okay? And then you have your summer solstice here when it is in Cancer, and that is June 21st, you know, the brightest day of the year. And then you have Libra on September 21st, that is the fall equinox, okay? Both of these dates are sacred because it's equilibrium. So when you know anything about life and nature, when you study mystic traditions, when you study esoteric or occult traditions, when you study nature itself, you see that the point of life and the point of like esoteric kind of inner paths is all about equilibrium, okay? All about balancing the chariot, balancing the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere, balancing the masculine and the feminine, that yin and yang, that polarity of free will, because when they are in harmony, then your inner life is in harmony, and then your life is flowing properly inside of you. But when they're not in harmony, then chaos happens. And so the same is for the world around us and for the natural world. And so these dates are so sacred because it's all about balance. 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness. You need equilibrium, okay? And that is why they're sacred. And actually, Libra, the scales, that judgment is one of the holiest feasts for Jewish culture, if you've ever studied, you know, Jewish holidays, and that is their Day of Atonement, okay? They spend the whole day fasting and praying and all that jazz. And then the sun just keeps going, and you have the winter solstice, which is then in Capricorn, and that is December 21st, okay? So you have this beautiful journey going through the sky, and then of course you have your Tropic of Cancer, and then you have your Tropic of Capricorn, and the sun makes its journey through the zodiac. So I wanted to make that clear because these books do reflect the journey, whether you realize it or not, and they also reflect the journey inside of you. And that's why I say the Bible is a myth, a map, and a mirror. It's mythologies telling you of astrology, telling you of psychology, okay? Because as above in the heavens, so below. And next week, we are going to see the sun starting in March, and we are going to start breaking down the quadrants of the zodiac, which if you ever studied astrology or that, you would know that quadrants are kind of the 4 aspects on like the soul's journey and kind of awakening, because just like tarot cards and many other mystic traditions, the soul is on a journey into consciousness, into becoming whole and complete, you know, integrating the two. And you also see that with the zodiac. You know, the first 3 quadrants are all about who am I, what do I value, what am I thinking about, and then it goes into integrating into your environment, and then, you know, you go all the way through to then your 4th quadrant, which is your Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, and that is all about integration into society. So Capricorn is like all about building values, and then Aquarius is all about the humanitarian and helping society grow and become. And Pisces is all about like, what am I even? You know, it's about that complete bringing of harmony of the spiritual realm down into like the physical realm. And so then that's where they make really good teachers. And you even see that kind of symbolism showing up again with the character Jesus in the age of Pisces. And so it is. There's so many layers working with these. It's honestly really fascinating, especially when you sit with them long enough and you're able to see all of the layers simultaneously flowing together. And then when you know other mythologies, you're able to just kind of like textbook correlate in your head of like, oh yeah, that literally mirrors the Greek mythology. That one mirrors this. And you're able to see the influence of cultures on these writings. And then when you understand human development and psychology, it also makes it really fun to see how the soul is at the same time going through that, because that's one of the beautiful things about like, especially the Jewish like Hebrew writers in like the Old Testament, is they wrote in like parodies, and I actually have a video about that if you want to check it out. And so they're always working with multiple layers, and it's called The Garden, and the deeper you go into it, the less it stops being about a story and the more it starts being about you. Okay, and these stories also work the same way. Jesus represents the character, which is you, that Son of Man, Son of God, and that is the path that you're supposed to take. So with that being said, I do want to get into the contradictions, and the first one I want to talk about is the birth of Jesus. And I am going to erase this, so if you want to take a picture real quick. But now I am going to erase it so that way I can show you a timetable to make it easier for you to see, because sometimes seeing is believing. And if you flip to your Bibles in Matthew 2:1, you are going to see a certain verse. In Matthew 2:1, it says, "And when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." Okay, so here we are seeing Matthew says that it was Herod the Great, Herod the king. Okay, it was not yet his son ruling, it was the father. And this matters in just a moment because you're going to see why. Now, if you flip to Luke 2:2, you will see that it says, "And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria." So here we're being told that Jesus was born when Cyrenius was governor. Now, that would work and that wouldn't be a problem except for the dates, okay? When you study history, you know that Herod died approximately 4 BCE. Okay, so here's our little timetable. And his well-attested census occurred in 6 CE. So I don't know if you know this, but that is nearly a decade apart. Okay, that's not like a couple days, a couple weeks, that's not even a couple months that the birth could be wrong. That's nearly a decade. I don't know if you know this, but if Jesus was born here, he would be about 10 there. And if Jesus was born here, that means Mary would be 10 years younger here. Okay? So that is one of the first major contradictions right out of the gate in the Gospels that we are seeing. So if these are factual, historical accounts, and they all work harmoniously together, then why do we have these contradicting dates so great and so far apart? That is one of the first questions I like to ask people who are still deep within religious psychosis of Kool-Aid drinking. The second is genealogies in Matthew 1, and then you'll also find the second genealogy in Matthew 3. Now, I'm not going to read the genealogies because they're long, they're boring, and it is currently 10 p.m. the day before this video is supposed to be released, because when I filmed this video yesterday, it crashed on me and I had to refilm. So that is also why we are streamlining this video. Okay, if you've ever taken the time to read these so-called genealogies, you will notice that after David, the family tree becomes completely different in both the genealogies. Now, when read esoterically, you do understand that these characters' names have meanings, and when you look up the name meanings of these characters, you start to see its own story within themselves of, consciousness descending into humanity and all that kind of jazz. But if we're supposed to be reading these as literal accounts, then both genealogies cannot be correct, and here's why I also say that. Now, I have heard it said, and I've heard it proposed with Christian theology, because Christians always have an answer as for everything, and that should be your first sign it might be a cult. And that is where one of the theories say that one of the genealogies in the text is Mary's family lineage. But they both say that they're Joseph's, and they both actually give different names for Joseph's father. And you can actually see that in Matthew chapter 1, verse 16, it says, "And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ." And then in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, you see that the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. So two different fathers, two different genealogies, both cannot be factually correct. So which father is correct and then which genealogy is correct? And I do want to mention another thing. If Joseph is not the biological father due to the Christian theology of believing in a virgin birth, and I mean, I get it, they were common events in the ancient world, as was being raped by gods, also common, nothing new, then the question becomes, how could Joseph's Davidic genealogy establish Jesus's bloodline? Now you can claim adoption, he took him as his own, but then the claim to the throne is still highly debated. And there actually is a book that goes into kind of the paper trail and gives you a new perspective on the typical Christian claim of how all this came to be. And it shows you that these gospels were not just written by authors who were just divinely inspired, but by rather highly educated Roman scholars. And it gives for an interesting read. Again, I like personally reading different rabbit trails and different paper trails and seeing different thought processes rather than the typical orthodox thought process, because I don't personally believe that they were accurate. And that book is The Piso Christ, if you want to check it out. And through that collection of essays and articles, it shows that not only a few individuals invented and built the Christian religion, and these same individuals authored the New Testament of the Christian Bible, it also addresses issues about how these few people wielded that much power and how they were able to succeed in pushing their theology. So if you wanted to check that out, it is an interesting read. Next, I want to talk about Judas's death. In Matthew 27, it says that Judas hangs himself and priests by the field. Yet in Acts 1, not the Gospels, but it is still attested to be one of the same writers who wrote one of the Gospel books. It says that Judas buys the field and falls headlong and is burst open. So which account is correct? Does he buy the field? Does he not? Does he hang himself? Does he fall and bust himself open? Then you have the crucifixion. In both Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they state that Jesus eats the Passover meal and is crucified the following day. You see this in Matthew 26, 17 through 29, as well as Matthew 27, 1 through 2, and then Matthew 27, 35 through 50. You see this showing up in Mark's account in Mark 14, 12 through 25, in Mark 15:1, and then verses 25 through 37. And then you also see Luke 22, 7 through 15, as well as Luke 23, 33 through 46. However, John says that Jesus dies before the Passover meal. And you see that in John 13, 1 through 2, now before the feast of the Passover. Then you see in John 18, 28, the Passover meal still lies ahead while Jesus is already before Pilate. And then in John 19, 14, you see the preparation of the Passover. And then you see that Jesus is delivered to be crucified in John 19, 16. And then Jesus dies in 19:30. Okay, so we have two different timelines, and I definitely, again, have heard theological debates and reasonings, again, the fundy gymnastics of trying to justify all of their theology. Honestly, is exhausting listening to it, and it creates for a lot of confusion in people's minds. And I think, honestly, that's almost sometimes the point, just to get people to shut up, have faith. You just need to have faith. These are divinely inspired by God, rather than actually thinking critically for yourself. And that's because a lot of religions, especially Christianity, they are thought-stopping theology. Okay, you basically leave your brain at the door. They do not teach spiritual discernment. They teach obedience of this is what you have to believe. You have to have certainty. This is what you have to do to be saved, and don't question the text. The text becomes so sacred and their theology becomes dogma, and dogma becomes untouchable. But it doesn't matter if 1,000 men agree upon a subject. If they know nothing about that subject, then their interpretation is wrong. So if you have an Orthodox sect of Christianity that literally built an entire theology on a misunderstanding, you're reading this whole map the wrong way, and you just keep building on it, that doesn't make you right. Just because you killed and filleted everybody who disagreed with you throughout history still does not make you right, okay? There were lots of different sects of Christianity. There were lots of different interpretations, and there is a much more loving theology. And that's actually something I go into about my book, You Are Art, is I start to show people the comparison of the Tao, the Gita, and the Bible, and I start to show you a more love-based theology, especially if you are somebody who has stepped away from the church and has struggled with, okay, I know there's truth within these texts, but I know it's not what I've been taught through the traditions of my church, so what is truth? And the answer that I like to give people is if your theology leads you into more separation, hate, shame, and condemnation, it is leading you away from the divine. Okay? But if your theology leads you into more expansion, abundance, love, and unity, now it is leading you closer to the divine, so that way you can transcend your religion and transcend basically eating baby food, and you can go on to actually understanding meat and understanding how basically consciousness creates. And that's when then your mind does start to expand and you start to have whole new revelations. And then you're able to continue on your path of, as Christians might say, sanctification, or your own path of spirituality, of then full circle of coming back to these texts and realizing the way that you were taught was just simply wrong, and that these stories are beautiful, but they have a whole new meaning that a lot of the Orthodox sects like to teach you that they have, and that's honestly one of the biggest struggles, is we have nearly 2,000 years of Christian fog from the Orthodox Church placed over these texts. Okay, and that is the Western heresy, is trying to understand these, especially through Western literalism, rather than through the Eastern mystic lens that the writers often wrote these texts in. The next contradiction I want to bring up is censuses. So Luke describes a census requiring people to travel to their ancestral hometowns. You see that showing up in Luke chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, in Luke chapter 2, verse 4. Except I do want to note something. Again, historically, Roman censuses typically registered people where they actually lived and owned property, not where distant ancestors had lived centuries before. Okay, because that is kind of out of context for these stories. And sometimes, mythologies were written with things out of context to get you to say, wait a second, that's not normal for that time period. What's going on? In modern day, people are just unaware of the cultural context, because that also is a theology that I have heard more than once in fundamentalism and in different sects and denominations, is you don't need to understand the culture and the context to read the Bible. The Bible's for the simple man. It's a simple book. Stop overthinking it. And it's like, man, that's some thought-stopping theology right there. That's ignorance, okay? And a fool's gonna be a fool, as Proverbs says, but the wise understand the dark sayings, because Proverbs also says that. So we want to understand the mythologies. We want to understand the allegory. And that means we should also at times understand the culture and the context that these stories were written in, and understand it through the lens that the writers would have been writing in their Eastern culture, not through the lens of Western ideologies that we have cultivated in our own mindset. Okay, and so in Matthew it says that Joseph and Mary are living in Bethlehem and then Egypt and then Nazareth, because they were refugees in Egypt. You see that in Matthew 2, 1 through 23. And Matthew never says that Nazareth was Mary and Joseph's home before Jesus's birth. That is also worth noting, because then in the book of Luke, it establishes Nazareth as Joseph's and Mary's home before Jesus is born, and then there are residents who travel to Bethlehem. So the next contradiction is the crucifixion. So in Mark, it says that it becomes dark at the 6th hour, at noon, in chapter 15, verse 33. And then in Mark 15, 34 through 37, at the 9th hour, 3 p.m., Jesus cries out and dies. And then in the book of John, though, it says that Jesus is still before Pilate around the 6th hour, again, noon. And then death occurs later in chapter 19, verse 30. Now, you can make the argument, as somebody who likes to make devil's arguments against certain questions that I have to try to prove them right or wrong, that John may have been using the Roman civil time, making John's 6th hour roughly 6 a.m. rather than noon, but the text does not say that John switched to a different clock system. So then again, that begs the question, which time did Jesus die at? And then you have the last words. So in Matthew 27, 46 and verse 50, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay, so that is what Matthew says. Mark also says the same thing, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Mark 15, verses 34 and 37. But, okay, Matthew and Mark say the same thing, but in Luke 23, verse 46, it says, Father, into my hands I commend my spirit, which does echo Psalms. If you read Psalms, that would echo Psalms 31, verse 5. And then John also says something different in John 19:30, it is finished, okay? And the Greek does translate essentially to it is completed / it is accomplished. And then you have the Centurion statement. So in Matthew 27, verse 54, it says, truly, this was the Son of God. In Matthew 15:39, you will see that it says, truly, this man was the Son of God. In Luke 23:47, it says, certainly, this was a righteous man. And then John does not give a statement at all. And then you have the fun one. This is our final contradiction that I just do want to bring up today within the Gospels, and that is the cross carrying. Okay, you are going to see that in Matthew 27:32, in Mark 15:21, and in Luke 23:26, it is Simon of Cyrene. Okay, so you have Simon in those Gospels, but in John 19:17, you see that it says Jesus carries his own cross. Those are two different accounts, okay? Now, if we're going to go by kind of group majority, I'm going to choose the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John does give a different account, which means, again, these Gospels are contradicting what is happening. And I also want to make note of the alternative Christian traditions in the early centuries, because this is where it gets fun. You have the Basilides tradition where Simon is actually crucified, not Jesus. And the earliest account of this is actually from Irenaeus, who was one of the early church fathers of the Orthodox sect. And something to note with Irenaeus is he hated the heretics, and heretics were any other sect of Christianity, especially the Gnostic sects. He also deeply despised women and deeply despised Jews, as did most of the early church fathers, okay? They kind of had that triple three, which is something that you should take into consideration. Anytime somebody has a venomous hate against another group of people, against another religion, against a gender of people, you need to then ask what ideologies and what theology are they pushing, and then therefore how are those ideologies being interpreted and how are these texts being interpreted through that lens. Either way, getting back on topic about the crucifixion with the alternative Christian traditions, according to Irenaeus in his writings against heresies, again, he hated heretics, Basilides taught that Jesus did not suffer, but rather Simon was transformed so that people thought he was Jesus, while Jesus escaped and laughed at their mistake. Okay, because that's also something when you study like the different faces and the different kind of character traditions of Jesus, he was seen more in a magician's light. That's why in a lot of like early Christian art, he usually has a stick, Hollywood wand, magician's staff, that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting because the connection, again, is there with these writings, is that in Mark and in Matthew and in Luke, you see that Simon carried Jesus's cross. And then again, in the Basilian tradition, Simon carries the cross and is mistaken for Jesus and then is crucified. And that's also where then the line of thought goes that Jesus escaped with his wife, Mary, and then they have a daughter. And that is a line of thought that some people go down, especially when then you start studying certain older paintings and certain other Gospels that were excluded, and then you also study like the artwork of like the hooked X, and you also see this in the second treatise, also in the Gnostic Gospels. The writer in one of the stories is identified as Jesus, saying his enemies believed that they were killing him, but it was another named Simon who bore the cross on his shoulder. Okay, and you might be wondering, well, how would somebody mistake that? Well, if you remember the Gospels, the canonical ones, Jesus was not that good looking. He was an average dude. He could easily escape into the crowd, and that's because he is not whitewashed Jesus, okay? This is not what he looks like. He would look more something like this, okay? He was a Middle Eastern man, okay? He was not a white French boy. I hate to break it to ya. Okay, so it makes for a really interesting kind of thought theory and processes when you're studying these stories of like, okay, which tradition is true? Not what I've been taught is true, but which one has the most evidence, and then why might or might that not be true? And it makes for a lot of good kind of discussions around a campfire if you are somebody who likes theologically discussing, debating like I do. And so I hope this video started to open your mind and seeing that there are different contradictions. And you also have a few other contradictions like with the Ascension and debates and questioning like leading with that on the different traditions of what it taught, of like actually like Luke shows basically it's happening all in one day, where Acts shows 40 days, but then those were both attested to be written by the same author, which then leads questions. And that's why I didn't bring that one up like in detail today. But yeah, I hope this really does start to show you like, hey, these are contradicting each other, which means they are not historically accurate, which means maybe, just maybe, they're not journalist kind of accounts stating what happened, but rather they're Greco-Roman style mythologies. And if we can understand the casing of mythology around the stories, then we can understand what the stories are actually talking about. So then hopefully next week, as we dive finally into the Gospels with the stars, we can see the traditions and we can see the transitioning, and we can start to have this kind of awe, inspiration of like, wow, Like, look at how much this like reflects Aries, and this is reflecting Taurus, and this is reflecting Gemini. And we can start to have fun with these to realize that they're reflecting the stars. And then also at the same time, they're simultaneously reflecting something happening inside of us, of that soul going through that journey known as the hero's journey. If you like this video, please give it a likes up and hit subscribe so that way you don't miss out on upcoming videos with the God Core podcast. And thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode.